All right, moving on.
Okay. So we just wanted to give you a little bit of background on who Wissahickon is. So we are a suburban school district outside of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. Our entire school district serves about 5,100 students, and we are relatively small. We have 4 elementary schools, 1 middle, and 1 high school. Really, in our district, our goal is really to foster equity and inclusion in our schools and promote equitable and effective instructional practices. And in our Office of Student Services, we've really been doing a lot of work to align to the science of learning just in general. So we have a really strong focus on the science of learning and the science of reading. And we've been doing this work for a few years. So at the start of last year, we actually began a partnership with Patton to come in and do some strategic support with, the structured literacy in our programs for students with complex needs. And just to let you know, this program right now that we're doing, or this initiative, is helping to support 8 classrooms, which is roughly 64 students, and it is K to age 22. Like age 5, sorry.
Yeah.
But the one thing we wanted to do now, if you could chat to Mr. Rosa, is, just what are your thoughts when you think about students with complex learning profiles? What characteristics do you think of? So if you could drop that in that chat.
So we have the need for coordination of services and supports. Multiple approaches are necessary. Students with a variety of needs, both physical and intellectual. Students with complex bodies who may be non-speaking. Consideration of multiple academic and emotional needs. Students who don't have curriculum for them, you have to build your own. Maybe some behaviors, limited progress within the general education curriculum, students who need lots of adaptations and differentiation of instruction and especially design instruction. They have a variety of needs, need to think how each student learns best, multiple needs met with care and time, often underserved due to the lack of staff or resources, overwhelmed districts, cognitive or behavioral needs to be met, not making progress in classroom, assistive technology needs, repeated exposure to concepts.
So it sounds, Kristen, from the things that people are sharing in the chat, that there's a lot of variety in those needs, and that people have a good idea when we're talking about students with complex profiles, like how vast those needs or different needs those could be.
Yeah, and that was a really great list. And I know that you guys have also brought up some barriers that can occur within districts as well. And I know, just to let you know, we can't touch on those pieces within the hour that we have, but we do understand those barriers as well. But all of those things are great things you said. The other thing, just to get an idea of the kind of the profile that we have in our district too, we're really looking at the students are typically serviced within autistic support, life skills support, or multiple disability support, and just some other things that we have been working with through this project. Are students that are using assistive technology like low and high tech. I heard people talked about physical disabilities, apraxia and aphasia, students with traumatic brain injury, visual impairments. So just to get an idea of kind of what the profile of the student is that we're talking about, but it does sound like a lot of you are working with students that meet that profile or have the same type of profiles.
Kate, the other thing that I think that we've really been attentive to through this work this year and at the end of last year was that each child brings a unique set of skills to the table as they're learning. And so really we have to look at each kid as an individual and see how we can best support to accommodate for any needs that they have that are inherent to who they are.
We talk a lot about how the foundational skills of structured literacy stay the same. What changes is maybe how we are using materials or, specific things about individual children. We always, Kirsten always says, it's not about the curriculum. And I think that was a big thing for my brain to have to process, that we can be using pieces of things, but that it can be really individualized. And I know somebody had talked about that interdisciplinary teamwork. That is a huge piece of this too.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on that too a little bit later on in the session. So this slide kind of highlights some of the challenges that are pretty typical that we see or hear when we start this work or we're working with teachers who teach this population, right? So potentially these are things that you may have heard or you may have thought as you're working on thinking about literacy instruction, structured literacy for this population. Oftentimes, traditionally, there's ideas around, are these students, quote unquote, ready to read? Do they have the necessary prerequisites to get access to reading? We hear a lot about limited time in the classroom that could be devoted to literacy instruction. In general education settings or with students without IEPs, typically when they start learning to read in kindergarten, they have a standard literacy block that's anywhere between 90 minutes a day to 120 minutes a day, maybe more. And the nature of what is needed from each one of these students that we've been working with doesn't necessarily allow for that chunk of time with everything else that they need. So there's a lot of discussion about that. And how do we prioritize literacy instruction in relationship to what else is needed for functional skills for each individual student to be successful in the quote unquote real world. I get a lot of questions from teachers regularly, not necessarily with this project, just in general, around what's a good program for this population? What can I purchase that I can use to teach? Sometimes we have teachers who define literacy or reading as their students' abilities to visually discriminate words as whole chunks. And we see them in working through something like a sight word program or something like that, knowing that this group of students probably needs additional repetitions, additional opportunities with certain pieces, and also typically have limited working memory or need support with working memory. Sight word memorization is kind of a big piece. And then the other thing that we often have to talk about or think about is, when do we abandon any one skill to move on for something else? And what are the priorities of various different skills that we're working through? It's our hope that we get to kind of address some of these typical challenges today and tell you how we've worked to head them off in our work at Wissahickon. So Nancy Young highlights 4 different types of reading profile for students when they're starting to learn to read. The first are students who it seems that learning to read is effortless. That's about 5 to 10% of the population. Or the second group is students who learning to read is relatively easy. With standard broad instruction. They may need some explicit support with spelling or writing. It's these 2 groups that we know that structured literacy is beneficial for. The next group is the group that learning to read is going to require explicit, systematic, sequential, code-based instruction. That's about 40 to 45% of the general population in our classrooms. And finally, that the group who are learning to read, and it will require explicit, systematic, sequential, code-based instruction, and the key here is that it has many repetitions. Those two other groups, the two groups that I just talked about, we know that structured literacy is essential for kids getting the components to learn how to decode and encode. And it's often our students with complex learning needs that are going to typically fall within this final group, that light pink group there. They're going to require structured literacy and need many, many repetitions. So knowing that, Kate and I spent some quality time kind of crafting or coming up with our theory of action, which is what you see on the page here. So this is a very complicated diagram and we're fully aware of that, but we wanted to try to encapsulate the work that we had been doing this year and kind of explain what all the major pieces to this were for supporting the district. So if you notice in the middle, we have structured literacy, evidence-based instructional practices, and data-based intervention. We're going to go into some of that a little bit more. And then on the outside, you notice that we have like workshops and professional development as a key piece, as well as having a professional learning community for teachers that are working through and brainstorming how to support their students. So they have often had opportunities to collaborate with each other and other professionals. We touch on that as well. And then the dark green arrows pieces talk about like a job embedded coaching model in which we had a collaborative interdisciplinary problem solving process in place where we worked very much on modeling and showing teachers how to work with the content and their students, and we worked in concert to coach them together, gradually turning over some of that to those teachers. The center of it all are the outcomes that we were noticing for students and for adults. So we started to see that there was an increase in student acquisition, accuracy, mastery, generalization, and retention of the skills that we were working on. And some of the byproducts of this is that we were noting that students were getting increased access to grade appropriate, rigorous content and more independence in literacy and language skills. Something that's not noted on here too for our older students is we were seeing that there was more opportunities that were kind of opening to them in regards to their transition goals. For adults, we saw that they were continuing to build upon their background knowledge regarding the science of reading, increasing their capacity around evidence-based practices in literacy for this population and in general, and feeling more and more confident in being able to explain why they were doing the things that they were doing and the instructional decisions that they were making for individual students in places like IEP meetings with parents or parent conferences. Do you have anything to add to that, Kate?
I was just going to say, I think the important piece and how we started all this was we had those two outcomes. And I think that was so important. It wasn't just about increasing student outcomes, but really supporting the adults that were teaching these children how to do that. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through.
The other thing I should note too is that we started this pretty much at the beginning of the school year in probably September. I don't think we were doing much in August at that point. I mean, we'd had conversations. But in September, we started kind of getting more to the meaty stuff. And across the school year, we in concert together with some other professionals and some other patent consultants, Meredith Penner is one of them, were supporting in classrooms, working with teachers approximately 2 times a month. So all of those 8 teachers and the support staff that are in those classrooms about twice a month.
And then there was some follow through with the district in terms of just carryover of what we were talking about in those sessions with patent consultants coming in.
Yep.
I will say the one nice thing was too, and we talk a lot about this as well, is all the teachers are just great. They really believe in the work. The support staff really believes in the work. You know, I feel like we were really lucky. It didn't take a lot of, you know,
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of barriers to us
Yeah.
going in and working with them or building rapport or,
yeah, that part was kind of already really established, but we had been doing work previous to this, in previous years, just reading books and some research about what we had planned to do. So I feel like some of that base was already built.
Mhm. And they'd had professional development and were pretty knowledgeable around the science of reading prior to the start. So this quote that's on the slide is probably familiar to many of you. It, as a general statement regarding teachers and their knowledge of structured literacy or the science of reading, Stanislaus Dehaene notes that most people get little to no professional training as teachers. And one thing that we also know is that typically special educators get less than their general education peers. So knowing that, or that kind of being a foundational piece, we really wanted to talk about. We knew that there would be some traditional PD or some additional or non-traditional types of PD that we were going to be folding in with our thoughts. So I'll let Kate talk a little more about what we did.
Yeah, so what we did in the beginning, we did put a survey out that we created for teachers just to kind of get a baseline of their understanding of structured literacy, like foundational skills, but also what their preferences were. It was anonymous, but what their preferences were in terms of the skills that they wanted to work on, and also what type of coaching they preferred. So that was really meaningful data that we got from them. We learned that they did have an understanding of a lot of the foundational skills. And again, we had done work in the district prior on just that, the foundation of structured literacy, but we had, even together, we still did some more, you know, traditional PD with the group of teachers and other staff, just because, again, we did want to make sure that everybody kind of had the same content and vocabulary knowledge around structured literacy, could talk about it in the same way. And then in ongoing consultation in classrooms, we provided a lot of that evidence-based coaching. You talked about this, Kirsten, already a little bit, but providing some of that direct instruction just in the moment when we were working with students. We did a lot of modeling, that gradual release, and then a lot of feedback in the moment. But I think the biggest piece of it was just the collaborative nature of it. So it was, you know, our support staff were coming, our teachers were involved in the problem solving and collaboration piece, but we also had our BCBA was there sometimes, our SLPs came in to talk about the language pieces, and also our OTs and PT. And just that interdisciplinary approach was, I think, so meaningful and helpful.
And, oh, I can click too, because you're talking about these folks too.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the other thing too, that I think you didn't necessarily touch on there, Kate, was also that outside of coming in and working all together all the time, we also had other colleagues that we were touching base with. You know, we reached out to our vision support folks in the district and at the IU, and in addition to the patent consultants who work with visually impaired initiative, or the assistive technology
At the IU.
at the IU. And you know, I was bouncing ideas off of my other patent consultants regarding pieces as well. So it's really a huge team who, in my opinion, really are imperative.
Yeah.
Good.
But again, it doesn't seem like a lot of work. And I know we talk about this later on, but I do want to put this in here too, that we really focused on things that were already present in the classroom. So it didn't seem overwhelming to anyone, to the teachers. I know I heard in somebody's that wrote in the beginning just about kind of the lack of resources. We didn't want to overwhelm everyone. We know since COVID, it's really can be pretty hard. But again, the teachers and the staff have really jumped in on this. They love it when the consultants come in, and just the problem solving is just, I think, the coolest piece of it. Again, that interdisciplinary approach kind of think takes some of that onus off of the teacher too, as, oh, I have to provide all of this. But when you have all the support behind you and you're able to collaborate and problem solve, it's really quite magical.
Well, and
Conversations and things we've been able to do.
I just thought of something that, as you were talking to, that I think is kind of important. I think the other piece too is ensuring that the teachers we were working with didn't feel like there's one right way to do something. It's not do this, not this. It's more like, how would this work? How can we help make this accessible for this child or several children? And how can we help you to make this happen as the classroom teacher? I don't feel like we went in as experts in situation more so than anybody else who was on that team.
Yeah, and I think the teachers felt that too. Like, yes, Kirsten and I think, and Meredith, the other consultant, were bringing a certain knowledge set, but we were learning with staff. We're all learning together, and I think that's a really great piece of it too.
Agree. So this slide really highlights that each person who is on this interdisciplinary problem-solving collaborative group or supporting the work really came with a set of knowledge and experiences that were different from those other people. So knowing that, some of us come in with this understanding of literacy knowledge. I understand the science of reading. I'm enmeshed in it. I have a strong background in structured literacy, those evidence-based practices for literacy instruction, and et cetera. And different programs, different assessments that will work there. The teachers who we were working with really had a specific knowledge of each of the individual students that they teach, what works with them, what's motivating to them, how they can access it, or access whatever we're teaching or the materials that we're using, what's the best way to present to them, how do they communicate, how do they show us what they're learning, et cetera. And we really collaborated around all of that to individualize the access for each kid.
Yeah.
This is simplified because you guys saw on the last slide that there's a lot more people involved, but we really like to show that it's really this symbiotic relationship where we're all working together to focus on trying to figure out the best ways for kids. Do you have anything there? Okay. So some of you are probably familiar with the simple view of reading, the Goff and Tumner theoretical model that states that proficient reading requires students to have word recognition skills and language comprehension skills so that it's very clear, or so that students can be proficient in comprehending and understanding what they're reading. This model, we just wanted to note too, that we know that foundationally under that simple view of reading, that oral language is a big component that typically happens for readers or beginning readers prior to getting formal instruction in literacy skills. And that if there are difficulties a student has with oral language development, that can be an indicator that they may have difficulty learning to read in the future. But the piece that for this subpopulation that we wanted to really highlight is this additional underlying piece. And I'm going to let Kate talk about that.
Yeah.
It's her beautiful term there.
So yeah, you can see that critical foundational skills, the light blue that kind of encompasses all of this. This is something I think that we have really been able to marry together with our different backgrounds, is just how important these critical foundational skills are. And I do want to preface this, you know, just because we're talking about this critical foundational skills, they may be barriers to access to instruction, but it does not mean that we don't teach in tandem all of these really robust literacy skills. But it is important to be aware of some of these other skills you do want to do assessment and explicit instruction for students that might have complex profiles. So visual discrimination, so your ability to see and understand the differences and similarities between objects, shapes, symbols, patterns. That's very important in terms of reading. Auditory discrimination, that you're able to recognize and compare and distinguish between different sounds. This also comes into play a lot. We have conversations just about whether some children might be able to auditorily discriminate what we're asking them to do between the words in a question. The visual perceptual skills, and this is just our brain's ability to interpret and organize visual information. You think about how important that is also for learning to read. Some of our students are still working on scanning and being able to scan an entire visual field. Obviously, we're able to accommodate and support all these things, but we also want to make sure that we're doing direct instruction. And just some other ones are joint attention is a big one too, the ability to purposefully coordinate your focus with another person's attention. So again, these are just that's just a small example, but we just felt like it was so important to put those things in place too. Sometimes I feel like when we're doing work with a student, their acquisition of skills might stall. And I feel like sometimes then our discussion goes back to, is there something in those critical foundational skills that might also need attention and direct instruction on, so that we're putting all those pieces together.
Are there any questions here at all?
Yes, we did receive a question. Our school is doing Edmark. It's a whole reading program with little emphasis on phonics. Are there any suggestions on how to approach or change this curriculum? Also, how much repetition?
So I'll answer the last part first. How much repetition? I'm going to say that's dependent upon the student and the skill and how it's presented. So we have some students that we were working with that we realized that there were some confusion over real words versus nonsense words, and trying to apply meaning to everything that was being decoded. So we kind of had to back that up a little bit when we got that formative assessment and say, okay, how do we explain for a child with potentially a language-based disability, something like autism, how do we explain or help this child to understand that they may create words that aren't like real words that they would know or have be able to attach meaning to, and they need to be able to think about the meaning of the word that they're decoding, see if they've heard, like, have that metacognitive process of thinking about is this a real word that I know, and what is the meaning of it, or is this a nonsense word? And so we had to do some instruction in that a little bit to kind of help that child kind of understand those pieces. And then there was a lot of repetition of some of those and kind of turning that skill into a type of game for them, so that it was something that could be repeated, practiced at home, utilized it in a variety of different ways to get that learning. I would say for that child, a lot of repetition in that. Like more than 15 times, like multiple days. And I think another component to what the work that we're doing is that we're taking formative assessment, and the teachers are taking formative assessment on their students the entire time their students are in school. So in some way or other. So that's happening 7 hours a day, basically. The adults that work with those kids are checking things and working with them and thinking critically.
And adjusting in the moment.
Yeah, adjusting in the moment, as they go through.
Or reaching out and problem solving with
Right.
team.
So the first part of that question, Kristen, that you shared about Edmark, we can't, as a patent consultant, I'm not able to endorse any specific programs over anything else, except I can say that based upon this simple view of reading, or this theory, and what we know from the, 40, 50 years of research around the science of reading, if a program does not have both the components of teaching explicitly and systematically word recognition, which includes phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, phonics skills, and orthographic mapping, and to automaticity and fluency. So when a student is reading a word or looking at a word, they're accurate and automatic in recognizing that word, as well as comprehending and those skills that fall under comprehension. I personally would not consider that reading. So knowing what I know about Edmark, and if you, later going back to Holly Lane's keynote from Tuesday morning, you can watch the recording of that at the Patent YouTube channel. She talks about this idea that there's a buzzword around science of reading, and we have to be critical consumers of the products that we use and know enough to say, this is not based or founded in the science, it's founded in something else. So that's what I would say to the Edmark piece. And I would, if you need to have that discussion, fall back on things like this foundational theoretical model from Goff and Tumner.
And I think there are resources are also in that tiny URL. There are some research articles too that will be really beneficial if you're interested, just in some of the research, putting all of that science of reading kind of into practice with students with complex profiles. So,
And hopefully that helps. So,
Yeah.
We have two more questions that came in.
go ahead.
Okay. So do you have a list of critical foundation skills?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Yes, I don't know how to, I wonder if they have the tiny URL, they'll be able to continue to access the tiny URL.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we can do is I'll create something and I can put it in that folder, so that you can look at it, and then, yeah, so that you'll have access to those critical foundational skills. I'm so excited that
I know.
that phrase will go out into the world. Critical foundational skills.
And the other
They are
thing,
so important.
the other thing I'll say too is they will have our email addresses there at the end. So
Yeah.
if there are additional pieces that you would like to continue the conversation after our session today, please feel free to shoot us an email.
Yeah.
We'd be happy to continue to talk and see how we can help.
Yeah.
And the second question is kind of related. Can you give some examples of what assessments / screeners teachers used?
Yeah.
We can, and that is a little bit of a precursor into some slides that we're coming to shortly.
Yeah.
So can we table that, and hopefully we'll touch on that in a bit.
Sounds good.
Great, thank you. Are you good?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna slide to the next slide. Okay, so this is this slide has a graphic on it that goes through some information from Chris Lemons. The link there, it is linked. The title is linked directly to the page where they can get this information. But it pertains, it's from the National Center on Improving Literacy and pertains to students with complex learning needs. So we know that students with intellectual disabilities deserve, and it's a civil right to have the opportunity to learn to read. And it is possible to learn to read. In fact, we have no evidence or no research, no evidence that says that this population cannot learn to read by the same methods as typically developing students, just maybe with alternate access. That's a pretty important piece because we do hear that pretty regularly, that students with these types of learning profiles need something different than their peers. And we have no evidence that they need something different. So we know that it is possible and that it's important for teachers to have this foundational understanding of the science of reading and evidence-based practices for literacy in general, and that we provide ample opportunities for students to respond to and engage in this learning. We use high quality, reliable, valid assessments that are aligned to the science and will assess the skills that students need to become proficient readers and hopefully writers. And that will drive our instructional decisions for those kids. We practice those targeted skills that each individual student's communication methods and how they access and participate in learning need to be individualized and considered. Accommodations and modifications will need to be made to those materials. So what did we start, like when we started with the teachers and these students in the classrooms, what were we using to begin with? And we knew that we wanted to start thinking about foundational skills, which give kids access to decoding and encoding words on the page. So we started thinking about what could we provide for teachers to use that would best suit their classrooms and how they were teaching to ensure that students were getting access to this type of learning. And we just like kind of landed on utilizing the UFly Foundation's curricular resource. One of the reasons that we landed here is we liked UFly because it was explicit and scripted. It came with materials that teachers could easily pick up and use. It matched their background knowledge. They knew the why to those pieces, and it had an appropriate scope and sequence. I would also like to highlight that of all the changes to programs, because we're thinking about really needing to individualize instruction for this group of kids. Teachers often don't know which parts of a curricular resource they can modify or change or not prioritize the same way as something else. And one big point, if you leave with nothing else today, is that you can modify a lot of the stuff that you're using, just don't change the scope and sequence of any kind of program that you're using. That needs to be left as it is.
And I think just as an example, in terms of using UFly, again, we know that this population of students, their needs are very different and can be very complex. So we weren't using, like Kirsten was saying, just going through the UFly book. Some of the students in our program are using UFly, are being taught from that curriculum as is. There's not a lot of change. We did build a scripted lesson plan that makes it a little bit more multi-sensory, and also giving more repetition and practice for some of those students. Then we have students kind of all the way on the other end of the spectrum where, again, we're just using the scope and sequence from UFly, but the instruction, again, based on the same foundational skills, but the instruction might look really different, but it is still hitting the pillars that we need to hit in terms of the instructional tasks that we're teaching. I know you can see on this picture, we have pictures of like large poppets that we use. There's cubes, there's, are you gonna share
I
that?
can.
Okay.
Do you think that would be helpful to folks?
Yeah, sure.
So we really have a lot of manipulatives, and it can be pretty much anything, like as wide as your imagination can think. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my share here to hopefully my document cam. And that should, there it is. It worked. Yay. We have these like large poppets that we provided for teachers to use in thinking about phoneme grapheme mapping or individual sounds. And for some of our kids, or the kids that we were working with, these larger pieces are easier to access than smaller poppets.
Which also can be visually distracting because there's so many things to pop.
Yeah, so we have to think about all of that, right? We have blocks, we've used Legos, these are Unifix cubes, we've used these, we have these in a variety of sizes too. We have used bracelets with pony beads to determine phonemes and count sounds. And kids can wear these and kind of count their sounds or think about the sounds. Because the other thing is thinking about some of our kids who do not articulate phonemes or sounds. We talk to them about them saying those sounds in their internal voice or their inside their head voice. So being clear that like we are all verbal. Sometimes it's just an internal verbal, right? And we also provided things like counters, if they were appropriate for that child, with these are Elkonin boxes and sliding them in and counting, moving them and mapping that to graphemes or letter combinations that match for certain words. We have magnets. We have anything we can do to make it like more multisensory and more visual, the skill. So I will say I really like the idea of a plastic plate with a little lip because it stops the materials from sliding off, keeps them slightly contained. Another idea would be even to use little foam pieces for sounds or for things like an onset rhyme to illustrate that. And you can absolutely attach letters or letter combinations to those.
And we have been talking a lot about that too, with the research coming out now about having the letters together. So it really, again, that just depends on the student too. We might have them without letters for a little bit and then move them to letters pretty quickly, but some of our students might need letters right away. It just really depends on the individualized child.
Yeah, so hopefully that's kind of a helpful piece in thinking about everything that may be.
The other piece on this slide too, in terms of assessment, I know that was the question that came up. So again, there's a wide spectrum for resources. So some of the students we were able to use DIBELS 8, the core phonics assessment, or even the PAST for some phonological awareness skills.
Here.
Okay.
I jumped ahead. Yeah, I jumped ahead a little
That's
bit.
okay.
Yeah. So we would start pretty much with thinking about phonological awareness and do students have that critical understanding that words are made up of individual sounds? And if they can kind of show us that they understand that by whatever means match their means of expression, then we made a decision then as our team as to what are the next critical pieces that we want students to start working through, knowing that our goal is to teach them how to decode and encode so that they then can have more availability.
Yeah, and I would say for students that were not able to engage with those types of assessments, it became much more informal and just kind of in the moment, looking at what skills they were able to do. Just like we were talking about all that formative assessment within our instruction.
And building upon those. I know this example here comes from Dave Kilpatrick's PAST test, which is a free assessment you can get at the link on this slide. We did not, for very many kids, we did not give it fully auditorially. And we did not attach timing and automaticity the way that it suggests for standard or typical learners. So we would illustrate the skill and what we were asking kids to do with some type of a visual. So for example, in this level H here, it says say sleep. Now say sleep, but don't say I would put the foam, like put little pieces of foam in front of them and illustrate that I was saying sleep, but take off the s so that they're seeing something and watching me remove it. That seemed to work for quite a few of them.
The other thing I think we did a lot too is sometimes with some of the students, we might not in the beginning hitting all of the pillars, right? We were looking for some means of access. So just as an example, we have a student who loves music. She is always humming and singing. So we took that as an access point to start with some of that phonological awareness and getting her to tap out rhythms of the songs that she liked and some other things. So that was just our access point for her and using something that was already highly motivating for her.
Yeah, and thinking about how the rhythm of the songs that she's familiar with, you're really saying those words in that rhythm, breaking those apart by syllable. So can she think about it, or can we assess if she's able to do that with those syllable pieces? Or some kids that we were trying to see if they understood that in a typical phrase that they say regularly, or if given a phrase, like a whole sentence, can they separate the individual words as individual words, or are they kind of co-articulating it? I think about like a standard phrase that might help if you aren't familiar with these terms. If you hear somebody say, "Did you eat yet?" we know they're talking about, did you eat yet? And can we have our students able to understand that in a phrase, there are different words that when we say it, oftentimes we put it all together, if that makes sense.
The other thing is, I know we're focused a lot on the word reading part of the simple view and the one part of like the reading rope, like that word reading strand or strands. But we also in our program, we're running very intensive language-based instructional programs. So we are hitting some of those language comprehension pieces in the program already. You can see in this picture, we thought this was cute. This is some of our kindergartners, just exploring books, reading to the students, building a lot of that background knowledge for them. We started to expand on a lot of those other pieces in that language comprehension, in the language comprehension strands. And we talk about this a lot too, with just building the love of books sometimes too. You know, sometimes our students don't have a lot of attention and focus. So sometimes reading a book to a student is only reading one page, right? Or 2 pages or a small section of a book, and that's okay. You know, we're pointing out words. We're doing a lot of modeled language. We're using, in our district, we use a lot of the CAR strategy.
Crowd in the car.
The crowd in the car. So, you know, we're commenting about something in the book. We're asking the students questions, and then we're waiting for a response, and then we're going to acknowledge and you know, kind of expand on that response. That's something that we could also, if you're not knowledgeable about that, we can put that in the folder as well. And then the crowd just helps you with asking different types of questions. We found it really helpful. We actually have those as teacher cues in a lot of our students, like instructional areas, if they're working in, you know, with literacy and books. So that's something, again, that we can also share.
Agree.
Kate and Kristen, I hate to interrupt, but you guys have lit off some questions that are happening. So, so if it's okay,
Yeah, go ahead. Let's do
Okay.
it.
so I'll start with, there were a couple of questions just asking if you would be willing to share the scripted lesson plan that makes it more multi-sensory.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually created it for our learning support teachers and shared it with Kirsten so she could review it and look at it. But absolutely, we can share that. And again, it is for Youth Life specifically, so it follows kind of the
Flow of the
sequence
lesson.
of the
Yeah.
lesson plan. But again, it just puts more like I said, multi-sensory activities and the opportunities, like it will tell you kind of in there to, give the kids more opportunities to respond and make sure that you're pulling more words that have the same pattern and things like that. But absolutely, we're happy to share that.
And also, if when you share, if you can share where you got the large poppets, that was a question.
Yeah.
Oh, they're on
from
Amazon.
Oh, Amazon. Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
So, and there was a comment about liking the foam too. So that was good. So,
Yeah, and this was just super cheap from like a Michaels or something.
okay. And there was just I'm just trying to get some of the simpler ones out of the way. There was a
Yeah.
comment about that sometimes early learning sites will list some pre-reading skills. So when you were talking about that, that was just a comment related
It's
to
great.
that.
Yep.
Okay, so now on to the a little bit more complex questions. So this one is, in our schools, the focus in special education seems to be behavior. Supports and interventions are offered to struggling readers. Often the supports and interventions offered to struggling readers often get pushed aside when a student is in crisis. We know that many of our student behaviors are often connected to their struggles with literacy. How can we help to shift this focus?
Yeah, it's a really big question. So I am also a BCBA, and I think I will say from our perspective in our school, we spend a lot of the beginning of the year on really pairing environments with a ton of reinforcement, instructional areas with a ton of reinforcement, our staff with a ton of reinforcement. So kids want to approach us, be with us, spend time with us, that their desk area is a place they want to come to, because when they do, they get access to all the stuff that they love, even if they're asked to do something that might be a little bit more difficult. I mean, my suggestion would be, I don't know if you have behavior analysts or behavior specialists in your district, but they're really great resources for helping support with those things. Because I do understand that can be a really hard balance, especially if you have a child who's in crisis a lot. And we do know, I think there's a lot of research out there that behavior can be a result of not being able to read and access. I mean, that's a really great question. I feel like it's a much bigger question than we can answer in this training, because we only have till 11:15. But my BCBA brain is saying that we just need to make the instructional area and the instruction full of the things that they love. So again, they want to stay in that environment and engage with those materials, again, because we've tied it to the things that they love. So even if that is, I know we've done for one student, she had a lot of elopement. She loves Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse. So everything, our letters have Mickey Mouse on them. We read stories about Mickey and Minnie Mouse, like everything involves the things that she loves. And again, I know that might not be overall helping, again, because I feel like that's a much larger question. But if whoever asked that question would like to talk a little bit more through that in general, and they want to reach out to me, I'm happy to talk to you through that.
I was going to say too, maybe in 2 years when we do the literacy symposium again, we can have a focus on that behavioral component and how that behavioral communication and literacy
And I
skills.
think the other piece too is sometimes, again, that behavior can be, it can be reading, but it also can be the language and communication skills that are also, we might be focused on. Like if I don't have the language to communicate to you that something doesn't feel good, or I want to get away from this, that if their children are going to find another way to communicate that to you. So it's really important to really figure out why that behavior is occurring so we can address that. Because yes, if you have a kid in crisis all the time, you have to kind of pull back sometimes on the learning aspect until you can kind of get that child in a place where they're well regulated and ready to learn. So yeah, I mean, that's a really complex question. I hope I did it some justice, but please feel free to reach out to me.
I have them open, Kristen, too, and I'm like, wow, there are a lot of questions just keep coming in.
Yes.
So,
do you want to pick
No.
the next one or
it's, well, as an old lady, my eyes are getting like bad. I can't read it that well on the screen, so I'm kind of
Okay.
relying on you to tell me. I see them, but
Okay, sure. So the next question that came in is, I know there has been a big push to have all students in core instruction. Sometimes I think it is hard to find that balance for each individual child. If you have a child with intellectual disabilities, say sitting through a core lesson in the general education class that is difficult for them, how do you find the right balance to have the time necessary to build their foundational skills with, the balance between having them receiving that access to core instruction or versus individualized instruction in the special education classroom?
So first, I'll give you the standard answer that as a patent consultant I give. Inclusion and amount of time that students are included is an IEP team decision, and I can't make a blanket statement about kind of the amount of time that I would recommend in any one setting at all. That has to be individualized. I think the other piece to this, as I'm processing the question, because that's a complex question, is we have to think about the priorities and the time that students have in school as to what are we prioritizing and what is the instructional goal of any activity over the course of the time that they're with us in any given day. So if they're spending an hour being included in core instruction and they cannot access the content, respond to it, and engage with it because it's not designed to meet their methods of engagement and expression or communication, what is the overall outcome, knowing that we have limited time with students and a lot of skills and needs that we want them to acquire while they're in school?
I would say my special ed supervisor brain is saying too, obviously we always want to look at the general education environment first and access to that core curriculum first. And what are we able to put in that environment so that they'll be able to meaningfully participate and access, with what modifications and adaptations, looking at the principles of universal design for learning. How are they accessing and taking in the information? What are we doing to support their engagement in that? And then also, how are they showing us that they learned what they know? And I agree with you. It can be hard to balance, but what we typically do is look at, okay, we want them to have access and to do these things, but we also need to look at what we need to do to have the children or the students make progress on the goals and objectives that are outlined in an IEP. So if we're saying, and again, regardless of where that's kind of occurring, is how much time do we need to do that and have them make meaningful progress?
Knowing also that a lot of these students that we're talking about, or this type of a profile, have additional needs from occupational therapy or speech and language goals and objectives that they're working on, or even physical therapy and working with a physical therapist. There are a lot of people involved with limited time regarding all of those needs in
Yeah.
any given day.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like it really is a balance, but again, regardless of where it's occurring, because that can look very different for different students.
Mhm.
Some students can, be in a small group in that gen ed environment, receiving that extra support from the gen ed teacher, and then repetition and practice with, support staff. Some might need to be pulled out into an environment that has less distraction, where you can really get into the nitty gritty, but also be using like reinforcers that might be really distracting to other students that our kids really are motivated by, so that we're able to get that engagement, like dancing around the room or playing loud music or videos. Sometimes it takes those things to get that engagement with that child. So you just have to, I know it's not, again, like kind of a direct answer, because it is so individualized and based on IEP team decisions. But really, to me, as a supervisor, we're looking at what goals are we developing with the team? And then what is the amount of time that we need to teach those goals? And then looking at where that can or might need to occur. It's kind of a continuum. I like to look at it and through that lens.
Mhm.
I hope
All
that
right.
was helpful.
Yes, definitely. We have 3 more questions. How do you measure reading comprehension?
Okay, so I was going to say, I think, like, first and foremost, if we're talking about reading comprehension or listening comprehension. So those are 2 separate kind of pieces, but depending on the child, can sometimes be assessed in similar ways. So the slide that I just moved to, you'd be amazed at how much you can get from a child by having them have a cold read of a passage or a sentence that we know that they've been explicitly taught how to read the words in that passage. So an oral reading fluency that they have the skills to read in some way, shape, or form, and then asking them to retell you about it or respond to questions or select something from a field of 3 or 5 or whatever about what they just read. We also do a lot of informal questioning as students are kind of reading. So we are very intentional, the teachers are very intentional with, as a student is reading, let's say, a decodable sentence that goes along with, the phonic skills that they already have. We ask them, wait, where is this taking place? One example is we had a student who read a little sentence about a bed, and we said, well, that sentence has a bed. Is this happening at school, or where did this happen? And we're attending back to what the meaning is within that sentence for that kid. And I mean, we weren't surprised, but they were very much able to say, oh no, that's at home. Or that's in, a hotel or away. It doesn't happen here at school because beds aren't typical at school, kind of thing. So we do a lot of that. I've seen some great strategies when I've been in various schools for inclusive environments, but also for other settings. It doesn't really matter on the setting. You can see this, like, it looks like a 3 facts from today. So that's just a protocol that can be used in any environment for kids, where they would either select using their AAC or pictures or however they can tell someone about what they were learning or what they were getting exposed to, whether that's listening or reading comprehension. But they pick 3 things. They don't need to be in sentences. They could be individual words, could be anything, could be images, but 3 things from whatever time period that they attended to or that they think are important. And then the other picture here is just story elements or story grammar. What is the setting? Maybe they're selecting from a few. Who are the characters? Can they tell you it's a boy, is a girl, is a mother, whatever it might be? That would be for a fictional piece. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Those are great,
Okay.
great resources. I'm going to try to skip around a little bit. Regarding students with an intellectual disability who are struggling to achieve word level automaticity, do you feel it is appropriate to ignore an expectation of automaticity and progress them through the instructional program's phonics sequence based only on accuracy after recoding words? Additionally, is it still worthwhile to spend instructional time on fluency building activities, such as the use of fluency grids, or would this time be better spent otherwise?
I don't know.
Okay, that's got a lot. Let me back that up. I think automaticity, we know automaticity is important and leads to, or, directly correlated to comprehension. Think about beginning readers who are decoding every word that's in front of them. And then after they've read, a sentence or a sentence and a half or however much, it's hard for them to then tell you, wait, what I just read, especially if they're reading things like 3 facts from, they're not going to have any idea what they read a minute and a half ago. So I do believe that automaticity, seeing something and knowing how to decode it and recognize it is important. I think with this population, it's hard to make a blanket statement because there are so many varying needs, but I do believe that getting kids as much as possible to fluency is important.
Yeah, I would agree. I also think what I would probably recommend at that time then is also that you can move on, but that you're interleaving the practice every day of those skills that you've taught previously. So there's all of that repetition and practice with what they've learned. And then I agree, like that fluency piece is going to be so important because it's one thing to have them reading isolated words, but our major goal is to be able, like you said, to get the overall
Mhm.
ability to read fluently.
And you can break words into parts. Like kids don't always have to read every word accurately and automatically. If they're struggling with a certain letter or letter combinations, you could practice automaticity kind of fluency drills with parts of a word. For example, a vowel and a consonant and a silent E, and they would just tell you what that part of the word would say and practice with that to try and get automaticity at that level before you add more in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we also did work with, I'm trying to think if this is related, but a student who was having a really difficult time like decoding, he could decode all the sounds, but then when he had to say the word fast and automatically, he could not. He would say a different word altogether. So we did a lot of work with him and broke the word up. So if the word was something like cat, he would first see the C and say k, and then the C-A together and say k, ah, cat, and then see all three together, k, at, cat. Or I'm sorry, the last one would be like cat, cat. So we were helping him learn how to like slowly decode those sounds together. That really, really helped with the fluency of being able to like read more quickly and automatically with, again, those instructed pattern, like words that included the instructed patterns that we had explicitly taught him.